It's that time of the week where we like to check in with Jeff Peterson, who's the president of Heartland Farm Partners. Jeff, on our recent conversation you and I had, we talked about how the elevators work when somebody's hauling their grain into town and how that all works in terms of contracts and how you're docked and so forth. I want to build on that conversation of kind of following where the grain goes after it comes out of the field here on today's conversation, Jeff. And let's start out with corn. In terms of where that corn is going percentage-wise, you've got a pretty good breakdown to help producers understand where their product is actually going, right?
Yeah, we sure do. You know, once that grain comes in, it can leave in multiple forms. It can go out by train, it can go out by truck. If you're on the Mississippi River, it can go out by barge. But you know, the feed demand in the livestock industry is so important to corn, and about 38% of the corn goes into the feed industry. But the ethanol industry is right there on its heels though, and the ethanol, you know, is sitting there right at 35% of the corn goes into ethanol. And then we can't forget about exports, you know, that export demand, the stuff that's going out, getting to our end users ultimately across the world, you know, that makes up about 17%. And then there's a category that we kind of forget about, that industrial use. So that'd be stuff that could go to high fructose corn syrup or turn into grits or flour or something like that. And when you put that along with seed, there's about 10% of the supply ends up going to that. Now, what's interesting about that though, one thing we gotta be careful about in that, feed's actually even a little bit more important than that 38% because how the numbers work and everything that I've given you is based off of what USDA's projections were in the October WASDE report. But the ethanol number basically looks at all the corn going into ethanol. But what we know is almost a third of that comes back out is either dry distillers or wet distillers and makes its way back into the feed industry also.
So as we talk about some of these uses for corn in particular right now, Jeff, how have you seen that change, say over the last 10 or 20 years? You mentioned ethanol. That's certainly an industry we've seen ramp up across rural America over the past 25 years or so, right?
Yeah, the trend has been interesting. Very seldom do we get a chance to see new demand come in like what the ethanol does. Prior to when the ethanol got going in the early 2000s, really what we ended up having, it was really what are you going to use the corn for, feed, or are you going to use it for food? You know, in that situation. So what happened is that as we ended up seeing the ethanol production come up, we actually ended up seeing the percentage that was going to the livestock industry or feed come down because ethanol was using a larger percentage. But we got to be careful. The details of it would suggest that there's even more of that ethanol going into the feed side.
Well, let's jump over to soybeans. How's the breakdown there? Where are soybeans ending up?
You know, it's a much different breakdown there, really. But and when we dig into the crush industry, which gets back to the livestock industry. So if you think about it, we take the soybean, we break it down into oil, we break it down into meal. The crush industry actually uses 50% of the soybeans. And then from there, the stuff that doesn't get used for crush, there's not a lot of other uses, you know, besides the crush and then ultimately the export side. So anything that doesn't end up getting crushed, about 48% of that goes over to the export side to get sent out to the other countries. But when it gets to those other countries, it gets crushed and turned into the oil and meal. And then what you end up running into is about 2% actually of that breaks down to go into the seed side.
Have we seen much change in terms of where soybeans are ending up with those percentages you mentioned over the past 10 or 20 years?
You know, there's some shift that's going on, and actually, you know, and in both the case of corn and also in the case of soybeans, you know, we think in the long run the the export numbers will come up some more. But in particular on the soybean side, we're actually seeing the crush continue to ramp up. And it's gaining, especially as we talk more, and we'll have to talk a lot more down the road about renewable diesel. We think in the future, looking ahead, that we'll see the crush continue within the U.S. to end up using more of those soybeans. Now, we've seen a big increase, you know, prior to the talk about the renewable diesel, there was a big increase on the export side because of the strong demand that China had ultimately for their individual soybean meal that would end up getting fed to their hog industry predominantly.
Jeff, of course, you mentioned we're getting these numbers from USDA. We're talking about the U.S. corn and soybean production. How does this translate to other countries, though, that are high producers of corn and soybeans as well? Do they see similar percentage breakdowns of the crush and using that for feed for corn?
So actually, it's really interesting. So if you take, let's take China, for instance, you know, China's going to import almost all of their soybeans. So if you were to take a look at them, you know, their percentages would be way different than what ours would be. And what's interesting for them also is that over on the corn side, that's also changing so that they're continuing to import more corn than what they would have been in the past. So I would say our mix that we have here, We're a very consistent and high producer on the corn and the soybean side. So what we're continuing to do is our exports are making up a larger percentage of what we're sending out. And then also the ethanol side here in the U.S., it makes up a larger percent of our corn demand use here in the U.S. compared to other countries.
It's important to break this down because as we talk about our daily radio broadcasts often, here's the export numbers and here's the crop progress. This is why it matters, because ultimately 50% of soybeans are going to end up being exported and so forth. Talk about how you use these numbers. I mean, how do you place the weight? I mean, we get the weekly inspections report in terms of exports on Mondays. How do you put that in perspective with, is that the 50% consideration, or how do you weigh all that?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And I'd probably say it's more of an art than a science.
Yeah.
But as we dig into that, how it all starts with that monthly WASDE report. So we get that report, we take a look at where the breakdowns and the numbers are, and then we look at and say, okay, now when we look at the ending stocks, when we factored the demand altogether, total supply minus the total demand, that gives us our stocks to use percentage. And by taking that stocks to use percentage, we can then come back to a particular price that we think is fair value. So what we do, and when we see the crush numbers and the export numbers, we're always continually tweaking that demand number to see what impact that ultimately should have on the price, working it back through that stocks to use percentage. The nice part is we have the ability to track the exports. Early in the week on Mondays, we get the export inspections. On Thursdays, we end up getting the export sales side, and then we do end up getting the NAPO crush numbers come out periodically also. So we are able to keep track of all that information actually pretty well.
Speaking of keeping track, Jeff, let's wrap up. What are some of the biggest factors you're watching this week?
Yeah, some of the biggest thing we're watching, honestly, this week now is we're kind of in that transition period where we're coming off of the importance of the yields. Now we're continuing to watch the yield, but harvest pace is going to slow down quite a bit because of the rains that we had. Now we're really watching ultimately what the export sales are doing and also watching those shipments to make sure that everything is moving along. We've also got a very close eye on the energy side. The reason we're watching the energy, the price of the crude oil and what is happening with the price of ethanol and the price of gasoline so much is that's becoming a bigger and bigger component in the underlying value of both corn and soybeans.
Jeff Peterson, the president of Heartland Farm Partners, joining us as we break down this week's market trade. I'm Bryce Duskett reporting.